A literary theme is a central idea or underlying meaning explored by a writer in a novel, short story, or any types of storytelling. A story's theme can be communicated through characters, settings, dialogue, plot, or a combination of all of these elements. Today, I'm going to look at vastly different types of genres and explain how they have all one thing in common: death. The majority of the time, death is an unavoidable but mysterious event. Fiction is one way to imagine and learn about it. Death is extremely useful in literature because it adds to plot twists, suspense, mysteries, and emotional effects to narration. It took me a while to come up with 3 narratives I was going to choose for this topic and explore their themes, but eventually I decided to base my choices off my favorites. One of my favorite books of all time is They Both Die at the End, The Lion King is my favorite childhood movie, and The Death of a Salesman is by far the most intriguing play I have ever read in an English class. So, without wasting any more time, let's get into They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. You know how that saying goes, how you shouldn't judge a book by its cover? Yet, in They Both Die at the End, to some extent explores that very premise through its blatantly apparent foreshadowing. Like, come on, the title of the novel is literally They Both Die at the End. It reveals the ending and we just gotta hope it doesn't happen. As readers, we're faced with the uncertainty prior to ever flipping a page, thus setting the stage for the entire novel. As the story of They Both Die in the End goes, individuals who will die within the next 24 hours receive a call from an unidentified organization informing them of their upcoming death. So basically, in short form, people get a call and they tell them that they're going to die that day or in the next 24 hours, and it's just to remind them to make the most of their last day on Earth. So, Matteo, the protagonist of the novel, suffers from a lot of anxiety and prefers to keep things to himself as much as possible. I'm gonna be quite honest here. Reading Matteo's arc at the start was honestly really unpleasant and depressing because throughout the 300-page book, we spend the majority of the start of the book just with Matteo in his room, pondering with his thoughts, just because he's such an introvert and does not want to go out and live his life. His mother's death really heavily affected him, and he's really scared to go out and get the phone call saying he's about to pass away. And the fact that his dad is in a coma just really adds to him, being alone. And, as readers, we learn to understand his point of view and come to realize that he aspires to be a carefree and a fun-loving individual. And after when he learned that he was going to die, he begins to take risks and trust others and really start to live his life. It takes a couple of pages for him to really get hit by the information that was received on the phone, and then he soon comes to realization that staying safe wasn't always the best option, and that him being an introvert really only hindered him. And that's where the build-up to the climax leads up throughout the rest of the novel. Matteo's goal is to live life to its fullest. Death is an ever-haunting prospect, and even as he confronts his past, he can never truly escape the fear of dying that pervades his experiences for his last day alive. The book questions readers how people can and should deal with their mortality. The novel's theme suggests that focusing solely on death isn't practically useful. Death is an increasing prevalent symbol of futility, and Matteo becomes increasingly aware of this himself, noting how, quote-unquote, I spent years of living safely to secure a longer life, and look where that's gotten me. I'm at the finish line, but I never ran the race. He realizes, rather, that it is more fulfilling to accept his mortality. It is critical to live a life to the fullest and do everything he desires, even if and especially if things could end in an instant. They Both Die in the End suggests that making connections and finding beauty in the world are more important pursuits than fearing death. Matteo's fear of living and then involvement to a character who is afraid of not living demonstrates how, in more ways than one, people only truly live if they accept mortality. One final thing to note from this book is that death is unavoidable, no matter how unjust it is. I liked the majority of the book, to be honest, but I must say that the final made me feel really depressed because it was just so heavy. Come on, the title basically gave it away, but I'm a lot like Matteo, and his nervousness was really relatable to me, which only added to the sorrow of his conclusion. Everything in this book comes together perfectly in a dreadful way, from the world building to the character development to even the trauma. This book really helped me discover my inner self and recognize my values as a person, and made me really realize that every day should be lived as if it was my last, or were my last, and sadly, Matteo died once he started to live. Now I'm going to move on to my second topic, and that's a Disney movie, and I'm sure you all know about it. Disney movies are well known all over the world, and with their catchy songs and colorful characters, you wouldn't really expect to see something truly dramatic in the cinematography while watching them. But 1994's Disney's The Lion King took a different approach. The Lion King taught us all about death and the emotional baggage that it brings. So the protagonist Simba, his father happens to die in the movie, and as a kid, that was honestly the first death I've ever witnessed in a film or even on TV. And it really just goes to show you how Disney really took it a step up with their classic animation movies and wanted to portray a heavy theme throughout this one. However, The Lion King did more than just introduce me to the concept of death. It also assisted me and others in reconciling the difficult, complicated emotions that accompany the grieving process. We learned, like Simba, that death can be illicit and a wide range of complex emotions, and that losing a loved one does more than just make you sad. You'll feel angry, frustrated, guilty, and burdened, but it's okay to feel these emotions. However, this intake about The Lion King is not going to be based off grieving and how people deal with their emotions throughout death. I want to bring it back to Matteo and how he lived his life scared due to, his mother's death, and try to somehow compare that to Simba and his father's death and how that heavily affected his life and made him hide from the rest of the world. So, every negative event in this film is caused by Simba's uncle Scar, Mufasa's brother, and his callous manipulation of his family members. It reminds me a little bit of Willy Loman's manipulative lies to control his family and death of a salesman. But Scar is so evil that he convinced a younger Simba that his father's death was entirely his fault and that he had to leave forever, abandoning his future as king as well as his friends and family.
Simba, what have you done? He's dead. And if it weren't for you, he'd still be alive. Run away, Simba. Run. Run away and never return.
Now I'm going to be completely honest here. Nobody and they both die at the end used Matteo's mother's death against him and to manipulate him into going into hiding. That was entirely on him and his emotions that took control. But in this movie, Scar kills Mufasa and then blames it on Simba to manipulate him to go hide and waste the rest of his life. This scene is so traumatic for everyone involved, but it is also a cinematic masterpiece that goes much deeper than it is beyond the surface. We need to also remember that while watching a movie, we don't always see the characters' thoughts and point of views, so when it comes to animation, it is easy to overlook the importances of direction and cinematography. Light plays an important role in the story because Mufasa and Simba rule everything the light touches, which is why Scar is frequently seen in shadows or poorly lit areas because he refuses to be ruled by them. Simba, believing Scar's cruel lies, flees his destiny to become king and his life to seek refuge in a sanctuary far, far away where nothing can harm him. It reminds me of Matteo and how he hid away for years in his room. When Simba's childhood best friend Nala reunites with him a couple years later and invites him home, he panics and says she doesn't understand why he can't. This causes an argument, and the music in the scene becomes faster as the animation and the facial expressions become more focused on anxiety, reminding the audience of what happened to Simba so many years ago and how the guilt of his father's death never left him due to Scar.
Sorry.
What's happened to you? You're not the Simba I remember.
You're right. I'm not. You're starting to sound like my father.
Good. At least one of us does.
Listen, you think you can just show up and tell me how to live my life? You don't even know what I've been through.
As Simba reconsiders return to Pride Rock to regain his rightful place as king, he is then led to a clearing where he is able to communicate with his father. The scene builds up to a heavenly intervention, with Mufasa's spirit form in the clouds. As Simba looks up to the sky and sees his dad, he is in awe of his father's majesty and tragedy.
You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life.
How can I go back? I'm not who I used to be.
Remember who you are.
This line alludes to how Simba ran away from home and left his entire life behind, hiding away due to Scar's evil intentions. similar to how Matteo spent his entire life hiding and not living. He says he can't go back because he's not who he used to be, as in, he truly believes he's a killer who murdered his father. Scar changed Simba's entire point of view due to using guilt and playing with Simba's emotions. The past can hurt, but from the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. This is the message the film wishes to convey and is one that we have carried with us throughout our lives. The Lion King may have been the first time many of us were forced to confront the idea of death, but it was also the first time we were given the knowledge to face that idea and overcome the difficulties that it brings. We saw Simba struggle with his guilt over Mufasa's death and discovered that it wasn't entirely his fault. We discovered that the loss of a loved one can have a long impact that is difficult to reconcile, even years later. Death is an important part of the circle of life and will be expected to carry on to keep living, learning, and changing the same way that Simba does after his father dies. Lastly, I'm going to finish off with one of my course texts I read this year, and that book was The Kite Runner. I'm going to go over how death profoundly changed the relationship between the protagonist Amir and his father, and how death can dramatically affect one's experience with life itself. I'm going to try to keep this bit as short as possible just because I went over in depth about The Lion King and how similar it is to the story as well. So just heads up, this is going to be a bit shorter than the other ones just so I can meet the criteria of the video length. Although we never see Amir's mother in the novel, she had an impact. Baba, his father, may hold Amir responsible for her untimely death as a result of birth complications, just like Matteo, and they both die in the end. In some ways, she serves as a bridge between Baba and Amir. As Baba pushes Amir more and more towards manly activities like soccer and kite flying, Amir resists by reading poetry books from his mother's past. Escaping his father's aloofness in his mother's books was the only thing keeping him from some connection with his father. Baba was distant towards Amir, and Amir feels directly responsible for his mother's death. Without me as the glaring exception, my father molded the world around him to his liking, as he quotes in the book. The problem, of course, was that Baba saw the world in black and white, and he got to decide what was black and what was white. You can't love a person who lives that way without fearing him too, maybe even hating him a little. So that quote tells the readers that they did not have a close relationship, but there was some sense of mutual respect. Baba was a powerful man and got whatever he wanted. Amir was intimidated by this. This shows us readers that Amir and his father weren't really close during his childhood. Amir's mother is therefore absent in his life but present through his love of books, reading, and writing. Because of her untimely death, she becomes a symbol for both Amir and Baba of things that are good and pure. Amir's desire is to win his father's approval is one of the driving forces of the novel. Amir believes he caused the death of Baba's wife by his birth, just like again Matteo and they both die in the end, and how Simba thinks he killed Mufasa. Baba acts similar to Scar in The Lion King, antagonizing Amir for the death and drawing Amir away from him and others in the process. The sense of intimidation explains his inaction during the confrontation in the infamous scene of the alley. Years of anxiety and guilt from his mother robbed him of the opportunity to develop into his own person. The Kite Runner showed me and its readers how the impact of death, even if arguably not responsible for it, reaches far beyond any immediate trauma and may stick with a person for the remainder of their lives. It could really change your perspective on how you see yourself and other people. So to conclude this presentation, I'd like to summarize the 3 genres I chose today. So for my first, they both die at the end. The theme I chose is that people only begin to live once they realize they are dying. In The Lion King, the theme of death can be used to manipulate people into doing whatever you want. Finally, the theme of The Kite Runner revolves around how death can alter a person's entire perspective on themselves and the people around them, ultimately destroying their lives. And as you can see, all 3 themes I discussed are all relatable in each of the genres. But as I made this video, I eventually realized that each of the characters lost one of their parents, which was the beginning of their demise and how the themes came to be in the tale. Matteo lost his mother at birth, which made him afraid of living because he didn't want to die. Simba lost his father, and Scar emerged and manipulated him into believing it was his fault. So, Simba fled away and ran away from his home. And, like Matteo, Amir lost his mother at birth, which made his entire childhood traumatic and never really allowed him to grow as a person due to the never-ending guilt he received from his father. I suppose I could combine all three topics into one simple theme. Children who have experienced parental loss are at higher risk for many negative outcomes later in life, which may result in different perspectives on the world. Losing a parent is pretty heartbreaking and traumatic, and has long-term consequences for children of all ages, both biologically and psychologically. Nothing is ever the same after a traumatic death, and the loss of a parent is a completely transformatic event.